Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you all. I'm really happy to welcome you all to the Rose Foundation's 2023 convening, Engaging People Power, Youth, Volunteers, and Boards. And today we're doing the board part of that. We're going to talk all about how to recruit for boards, how to set expectations, how to manage conflict. But before we dive into that, I want to step back and take a moment to honor the land that we're standing on and the Native people who've lived and continue to live on these lands despite federal, state, and local policies of genocide, the theft of Native land and culture. So the Rose Foundation acknowledges with respect that the land our office is on today was and continues to be Huichin, the unceded land of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, known as the Confederated Villages of Lisjan. We also recognize that many of you are connecting from different territories, and we really want to encourage you all to just take some time, take a moment to learn a little bit more about the original stewards of the land where you reside. We're going to put a mapping resource into the chat that you can use to do that. In the last 2 years, the Rose Foundation has allocated about $57,000 to Indigenous grassroots organizations in California, and we're going to continue to do that work. But we want to invite you all to join us in directly supporting organizations in your own communities. And we have a few suggestions that we're going to add to the chat, so please consider offering your support to one of the following organizations. We have the Sogorea Te' Land Trust in the Bay Area, Friends of Puvunga, for those of you in Southern California, and Native Health in Native Hands, for those of you up in the north. Now, welcome. My name is Aurora, and I'm the program officer for our grassroots funds here at the Rose Foundation. And I'm very excited for today's session. I hope you all brought your thorniest board-related questions. So this is the final session of 3. So if you missed the earlier sessions on youth engagement and volunteer management, we've got those on our website. Feel free to check those out. We'll add links to that in the chat as well. And if you're based in the Bay Area, please think about joining us next Friday from 5 to 7 p.m. We're going to have a happy hour here at the office. There's going to be great food, good drinks, costumes, and yeah, come kick off the Halloween weekend with us. It should be fun. All right, so let's dive in. Today, we're being joined by 4 fantastic speakers. I'm really excited to introduce them all. We have Evelyn Andrade, Executive Director of Earth Corps, Jacqueline Eccles, Board President of South River Watershed Alliance, Pam Fujita-Yuhas, who served for 25 years as the Foundation Director for the Northwest Fund for the Environment and is on a Rose Foundation Funding Board up in the Pacific Northwest, and Tom Hayashi, Chief Capacity Building Officer at the Center for Volunteer and Nonprofit Leadership. So welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you, Pearl, for getting us all squared away with the Zoom spotlighting. And panelists, I want to give you guys the chance to introduce yourselves. So for our first question, would you just share a little bit about the work that you do with your organization and maybe your own kind of personal history with nonprofit boards? Yeah, Pam, would you mind getting us started? I'm just toss it to you. And then when you're done, would you just pick someone else to send it off to?
Sure. Thanks, Aurora. So I'm Pam Fujita-Yuhas. I she, her pronouns. As Aurora said, I was for many years the co-director of the Northwest Fund for the Environment. And in that capacity, I both recruited and supported a board, as well as worked with the grantees of the foundation through many governance questions and issues for their own boards. In addition, I also served on many boards of human service arts organizations. And I'm happy to be here today to be a part of the Rose community and answer questions and be in discussion with you about the best ways to help with your books. And I will toss it to Evelyn.
Hi, everybody. I'm Evelyn Andrade. I use she, her pronouns. I am the executive director at Earth Corps. And at Earth Corps, we partner with AmeriCorps and we do environmental restoration as well as youth leadership. So we have youth that come from all over the country as well we also have an international program that averages 20 to 30 years old. They come here for a 6-month or a year-long service term where we teach them how to restore the environment as well as leadership skills. And I've been in the role now for about a year and 9 months and was brought on to lead the org in a new direction focused on environmental justice and racial equity. And so we've shifted our work as well as our funding model to really allow us to engage the community and co-create projects in partnership with communities. So really excited about our new direction. And my experience with the board is definitely building my own board, the current, inheriting the board that we've gotten, and then doing work to recruit and retain board members, as well as once upon a time, I was the development director for another nonprofit that did policy work in the climate space. And I had lots of experience with the board there as well. And I will go ahead and pass it to Tom.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Hayashi, and my pronouns are he, him, and I am the Chief Capacity Building Officer for the Center for Volunteer and Nonprofit Leadership. We are based in San Rafael, California, but we also serve as a regional capacity builder for Nampa, Sonoma, Marin, and Solano counties, and we also have our engagement in other regions and also involved in national work, particularly in building the capacity of nonprofit organizations. So we are a nonprofit organization ourselves, founded in 1964. Our mission is to help other nonprofit organizations pursue their mission and vision. So we work very closely with organizations that are small, medium, large, extra large, some who are really well known, as well as others that are maybe not yet to be as well known, but yeah, we have a lot of experience in this area. And on a personal side, I spent over 25 years in the nonprofit sector. First started out as a fundraiser and have progressively been involved in serving as an executive director of local organizations as well as national organizations. I currently serve on the board of the Japantown Garage Incorporated, which is an interesting organization which basically runs the garage, the parking garage in Japantown, and provides the proceeds to the city and county of San Francisco. In the past, I've also served on the board of the Asian Pacific Islander American Scholarship Fund and other organizations as well. So have a lot to say about some of the myths and some, quite frankly, problematic practices that tend to persist. And I think we need to think definitely outside of the box in this area. So looking forward to learning from others and contributing today. How about if I also invite Jacqueline?
All right. Thanks, Tom. Had to get the unmute there going. My name is Jacqueline Eccles, and I am board president of South River Watershed Alliance. That's what I call a frontline environmental group in Atlanta, Georgia. I've been board president of the organization for 13 years. So I can share a lot about boards. In South River Watershed Alliance is our focus is, of course, on the South River with the goal of restoring the river for the benefit of nature and the surrounding communities. The community, it's one of only two urban origin rivers in Georgia. That is, the river starts in urban Atlanta. And so with that, it comes with a host of issues, because the community is primarily Black. about 70%, 76% Black, and the river has been really degraded for a really long time, and so you have a combination of the impact of degradation on an environmental justice community where racial equity, particularly as it relates to the environment, has been a struggle for a really long time. So we, over the past 13 years, and oddly, over the past 13 years, when you look at the issues, they have escalated. So whereas, for many, many years, you kind of had a level period of environmental injustice, but the goal being there. But in the last 13 years, there have been a number of major issues associated with the upper South River watershed, which is the urban part of the river, that hopefully I'll get a chance to speak to in a few minutes. In terms of my background, my involvement with environmental groups has just primarily been at the grassroots level, where it's been issue oriented. There was an issue that needed to be addressed, and a bunch of people get together and say, we're going to take it on, and that's what we do. So we were kind of self-directed. And sometimes I say without the trappings of a board, because they can be that, primarily because you're adhering to regulatory requirements of being a 501c3, because that is really what drives this whole notion of a board. And it can have its challenges, which I'm sure we will talk a lot about today. But that's pretty much me in a nutshell, and hopefully we'll learn more about each other as we move through this program.
Thank you all. Okay, so to sort of start at the beginning then, for those of you who've been involved in building a board, could you share a little bit about what that process was like, how you went about doing that? And then maybe more broadly, what recommendations do you have for board recruitment? Evelyn, would you be willing to start us off?
Yeah. One, I would say it's always an ongoing effort, especially as board members term out, or in our case, we had some board members who were no longer necessarily aligned with the new direction of the organization. So we had that happen as well. And so I think there's a couple different ways you can go about it. A lot of it is word of mouth and your own network, as well as the network of your board, being clear in alignment about what you're looking for in a board member. So at EarthCore, my priority is diversifying the board as much as possible and making sure that all our board members are in alignment with the vision and the new strategic direction. I think this is super critical because in my case, the board is they're my boss. They can fire me, they can hire me, or they're responsible for my salary. And so I think ensuring that you have folks that are on the same page of what your vision is for the organization is really important. And in our interview process for us, because it's environmental justice and racial equity, we do ask, we focus some questions on those areas just to make sure there is alignment. I also do phone calls with anybody that we're interviewing initially, just to understand their interest in the work, their interest in being on the board, and also their capacity, right? It's important that you have board members that can be engaged to the level that you need them to be engaged in. Another strategy that is different for us, because our goal is to diversify the board, is we don't have a board giving requirement. Many boards have a requirement where you have to give $10,000 or a minimum giving amount. We don't have that. What we ask folks to do is do a meaningful gift for them, and that amount is different for every single person. But we do ask that, like, EarthCore is one of the biggest nonprofits. Their largest donations go to EarthCore, but that amount is up to them based on what is personally meaningful to them. And one thing that has also been helpful for us is we put our application for board members on our website. So that way, anybody who visits our website can take a look and show interest and apply. They don't have to necessarily already have a connection to me or any of our board members or any of our staff members. So we have actually found quite a quite a good bit of people that have just cold applied through the website, which we have found to be super, super helpful. Those are probably the big things I would say, but I think the most critical piece is ensuring that whoever you do recruit to your board is in full alignment with your vision for the org as well as the strategic plan of the organization.
Evelyn, you want to just
I
pass it?
pass it. All right, I'll pass it to Jacqueline.
All right, that boards are this interesting topic for me. The interesting thing about South River Watershed Alliance is that I'm not paid, and I don't want to be. I'm retired and quite sufficient, at the income level where I am, and so that's not an issue. And I think for that reason, as Evelyn mentioned, I don't work for anyone. I work for the good of the organization, and make decisions there, based on that. So, my entire focus is achieving the goals and the mission of the organization. When I took over, and I also took over the organization, as I said, about 12, 13 years ago, and I inherited some board members, and some of the original board members are still there, some are not. Others I've recruited, and actually, sometimes I will get folks who are interested and they reach out to me. And I have a long conversation with them, because when you're a frontline organization, what I need is a working board. I need people to step up, not just when in a crunch, or when something really needs to happen, but just will reach out to me and ask, what can I do to help out, because everybody, of course, we have the treasurer, who is also volunteer, and a vice president who's also volunteers and very busy. So, and I manage the number of board members, because that can get to be a job. I mean, actually managing boards can be as much of a job as trying to solve environmental problems. And I don't need two equally weighted tasks, major tasks, as it relates to addressing issues. And sometimes people are a good fit, and sometimes they're not. I do a lot of the everyday work associated with the board, because I do recognize a lot of times that I need the board more than they need me, because I'm always very aware of the requirements to have a board, and the activities associated with that. And with frontline groups, those kinds of board members can be difficult to find. Being an activist, frontline, action-oriented organization can create a different set of demands than a lot of people are used to, that are associated with boards. And I've found that to be it can be an obstacle, so managing the board, and as it relates to achieving goals, and as it relates to the organization, I think it's quite a different task when based on the type of organization that you are, and the types of responsibilities and the goals that you're trying to achieve.
Jackie and Evelyn, would you mind sharing how many people are on the boards that you're talking about? We've got a question about that in the chat.
I have, with myself, there are 9 of us. I did have 10 and the individual rolled off, and I'll share that later. It just speaks to some of the issues that you can have. So besides me, there are 8 other board members.
And we're currently bringing on some folks. I don't know the exact count right now, but it's somewhere between 14 and 16. And I think we're trying to get closer to 20.
Cool. Okay, thanks. Then Tom, would you take the original question? Just,
Sure.
what kind of recommendations about board recruitment do you have?
Yes. So at CVNL, we have 11 board members. We obviously have the odd number for a purpose so that you could break the tie. But we did definitely need a double-digit, number in order to support the work. It's partly because we wanted to have a diversity of partners and folks who have a vested interest in the success of the mission and the vision of the organization. So structurally, we wanted to make sure that we have majority of our board members who are our member organizations, because we have a membership program at CVNL. So these are organizations that are members to CVNL, right? They're dues paying and they're involved in many of our programming and the like. So I think that's probably a good place to kind of start to think about what is the structure that you want and what is the purpose of that. I've been on boards where they've had consumer members. In other words, these are folks that receive direct services from the organization, like clinics and that sort of thing. So again, I think you want to be intentional about the board composition. I think another area that I tend to think about, especially for our organization, but also others, is I think board recruitment should be based on needs of the organization. So if you need someone with a particular expertise, someone who has relationship and access to certain networks that have critical resources and maybe even partners that will advance your mission, that's what should be driving it. So I think you want to be very strategic in that way as well. So we tend to have, obviously, that's already been covered, members, volunteers, funders. So there are a number of board members who are our key funders. And I would say, in terms of how do you find these folks? So there's a number of different strategies that I'll just share. We have in the past reached out to employee resource groups of corporations. So they are often asked to be involved in the community. And so, that might also help with your fundraising and that sort of thing. Also, any organization that has alignment with your mission that has a vast network. So it could be in our area, other capacity building organizations. It could also be, more traditional, like Chamber of Commerce, other community organizations as well. And then we also have a volunteer match website that we allow organizations to post for board service opportunities called volunteernow.org. But that's primarily for our service area. And so those are some things. And then let's not forget, boards should be involved in the recruitment process in partnership with the staff. So they should really be generating nominations as well. So those are some of my experience as well. Thanks. Has everyone got Pam? Have you shared?
Yeah, Pam.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. Just want to echo what everyone's said so far. So the foundation board that I served for many years is a slightly different situation in that it started out being a small group of people recruited by the founder of the foundation, and then over time grew to be much more of what I would consider a community-based board. And about 3 years ago, the foundation embarked on a process because they wanted to be deliberate about getting better representation from the community on the board. And so went from what I think would be described as a kind of a personal recruitment, board members recruiting other board members, to an open process. And in terms of like what Tom was saying about having needs drive it, the board created a matrix of sort of the skills and expertise that they needed, and then went out and deliberately said, we're going to open up this recruitment, but we're going to sort of evaluate the people who throw their hat in the ring based on the criteria that was needed. And that was actually very helpful because it created sort of a very open, visual, transparent part of the board recruitment process. And I think particularly for foundations where I think in philanthropy, you sit in a very public privileged position, right? And in our case, we're making grants in the community. So you have decision-making responsibility for providing resources. The board wanted to make sure that they were honoring the commitment to the mission of protecting the environment in Washington, promoting environmental justice, being a movement-building organization, and that the board reflected those values. So having the matrix sort of helped kind of raise the platform of that criteria. And I think the other thing that was helpful was just when we went out into the community to do the recruitment, and that was done both by staff and a committee of the board sort of focused on recruitment, we tapped the expertise of organizations who were focused on leadership development, particularly in spaces like the BIPOC community. So we went to organizations like, in our case, in the Puget Sound region, Puget Sound SAGE, which is an organization that trains people to serve on public boards and commissions as one of their programs. And tap into that expertise. There's also an organization called Leadership Tomorrow in the Puget Sound region that takes people through a training program about board service. And those people already come with a couple of things that are very attractive to serving on boards, meaning they've already raised their hands saying they want to be in a service role. They're willing to engage their time to become trained and do a service project. They're part of a network. And so this organization also has sort of I believe it's a quarterly newsletter where they would put out a list of community organizations that were seeking board members and connect their alumni network with these people. And that was super helpful. So we tapped into that as well. And having a job description that could go to an entity like that so they knew what the expectations were about some of the common things we've already discussed, like time commitment, as Evelyn said, whether there's some kind of fundraising expectation or personal commitment to the organization, things like that, and being very explicit at the outset about what the expectations are, I think is also super helpful. So that people know what they're getting into. And one thing I would just also say is, as Jacqueline said, it's really important to make sure that the people that you are recruiting are in line with the organization. And one way of sort of testing those waters before making a full commitment could be something like having a committee that's not necessarily a full board member, but is serving a function for the organization, where somebody can be introduced to the organization, serve some time, but not be a full board member, such that if it does turn out that, say, they're way too busy to make the commitment, or they don't have the capacity, or if there's some kind of conflict of interest, which sometimes happened with the foundation board, because one of the strategies that the foundation pursued is litigation, which can be, some people view as very risky. And some attorneys who served on our board are also representing organizations that we funded, and that could be kind of tricky. And so being really explicit about how you handle those conflicts up front can be very, very helpful as well.
Thanks, Pam. We had a follow-up question in the chat about what's the best practice to have the board president or the ED recruit for the board? And is there any kind of conflict of interest in the ED doing that? And Tom, you responded to that. Anyone want to speak to that briefly?
I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, technically, yes, there is, you could say that it's a conflict of interest because you're working to hire your own bosses. But I do think that ultimately the board still has to approve this person, right? So there's, for in our case at least, right, we have an interview process where it's not just me on that interview panel, it's other board members, and then they all have to get approved by the board as well. So it is still a process that the entire board has to approve. It's not just me self-selecting folks. And in my case, my board does a very good job at recruitment, so I haven't actually recruited many myself. But I know others who are more, other EDs who are more active in the recruitment efforts.
Thanks, Evelyn. Any other thoughts on that? Jackie, did you want to say something? You're muted.
And I keep going back to the kind of organization that you are, and the issue, even down to the issues that you address. You know, South River Watershed Alliance is, as I said, it's an advocacy group. I mean, we advocate for the environment. We advocate for the community. And actually we do a whole lot to be as small as we are, you know, with a board of 9 people. And also, you know, for us, and I'm sure, you know, knowing what I know about the Rhodes Foundation, a lot of the folks on the call, and that is diversity of our organization is a critical issue, because that question appears on grant applications more and more these days. You know, just what is the diversity of your organization. So I have to even be careful with that, you know, and be sure that there is that balance, you know, which can be very you know, depending on the issue. For instance, the makeup of the population and the South River watershed is 76% African American, 85% African American people of color. That's a huge number in an urban environment. And so, you know, I have to be very aware that even with that small number of people, that there is a balance, just so that I don't miss opportunities to raise funding, you know, because of this imbalance of the board. And yeah, so it's different. You know, I would be interested to hear what some of the other folks on the call that may be in the same category with South River Watershed Alliance and how they handle it, because it is different. I mean, there are a lot of concerns that I have to be very careful about, and that sometimes I wonder if, particularly with funders, you know, who obviously have a lot of money and have a big board that they don't have to deal with. So I'm you know, constantly reminding them of that, you know, when I write up my applications. We, you know, we are not your typical well-heeled, well-fleshed out, you know, organization, you know, that that you typically look at when you think about a 501c3 organization.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm going to store that for when we open things up to the larger group. I think that's a really great place for us to start a conversation. But for the time being, I want to kind of steer us in a different direction. I've been hearing a lot about the importance of fit and setting expectations. So my next question for you all is, like, how do you establish expectations and processes so that the board can work together successfully? And so there's also a system for accountability if things, you know, don't go the way you planned. Maybe Tom, would you mind starting us on this one?
Sure. On accountability, So I think there may be a burning question in the chat around family members serving on the board. So yeah, we'll get to that as well. But I think accountability really starts with at the recruitment stage, and being very clear about what is your philosophy around accountability as an organization, and particularly the board. I think it's hard for folks to be accountable if, for instance, it's not very clear what the board members' roles are, right? And so I think that needs to be, I would start there before sort of, asking folks to be accountable. And what does accountability really mean? Does that, and how do you know when someone's accountable and when someone's not? So many boards kind of struggle with this whole thing about having performance evaluations and performance plans for board members. And that tends to be the best practice for accountability. But I think it really starts with the board, among the board members, to start talking about what does accountability mean, what we are committing to, and what's to be expected. I'll just, just pause right there. On this issue about family members serving on boards, I would say I wouldn't necessarily focus on whether if there are familial relationship between board members. I think I would focus more on the conflict of interest issue and how to address it, regardless of whether if they're married to each other or if they have any kind of a relationship with each other in that way. So, but I don't think that it's necessary. I don't think it's prohibitive or that you shouldn't have family members serving on boards, but there could be some issues that arise from it. But I wouldn't let that stop you from having board members who happen to be related to each other from serving on boards.
Pam, do you want to speak to setting expectations for success and accountability?
Sure. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, I think having a written job description is a great way to set those expectations. You have a clear sort of sense of, if the board meets 6 times a year, you expect attendance in at least, 2/3 of those meetings. We all understand people are busy and sometimes they miss a board meeting. But if you set those expectations up front, then everyone knows what's expected. And if someone just can't make that minimum, then, you put in place a process where, say, the chair of the board or someone in charge of kind of governance can sit down with that person and say, look, you signed up to be on this board, but you're missing all of our meetings, and we really can't afford to have someone in the role who can't, serve meaningfully. And I think that's one way to sort of help with the accountability question is, like I said, setting those clear expectations, having something in place that everybody agrees to when they come on or is educated about even in the recruitment process. Another thing that we found helpful was having new board members teamed with current board members so that new people coming on, it's sort of like a buddy system, can learn firsthand from an experienced board member what the cultural norms are of the organization. If they have a question about serving or a policy or what have you, they have somebody they can go to where they may not feel comfortable, being the new person on the block, asking questions, but someone can help them out, and it doesn't have to come up in a full board meeting or on a group email. And that can be one way to sort of ensure that there's a good communication loop for new people coming into the organization. And then I think that's sort of part of a larger picture of really trying to be clear with people who are coming into the board and people who are currently on the board about what the shared cultural norms are of the organization. So if there's an expectation that when you come to a board meeting and there's a decision on the table, that the model for making that decision is consensus. That means everybody has to participate. Everybody needs to provide feedback and input. And so being explicit about what the norms of the organization are sort of help kind of diminish these, I think, kind of gaps that some organizations can fall into when there are questions and people don't know where to go to for answers or how to kind of resolve things. Just trying to be as transparent and open in your communication as possible, I think really helps. Evelyn, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, similarly, we have a board orientation for every single board member that joins the board, where we go through list by list. And in the interview process, we also go through those requirements just to be like, you know, do you think you can do this? Do you think you have the capacity? And then we reiterate them again in that board orientation. We did have one board member who was not meeting their requirements this past year. And we have a nominations and governance committee, which manages a lot of this. So they manage the interview process, they manage the applications, they manage the onboarding as well. And, you know, making sure that we're meeting the requirements that we want on our board, right? The diversity that we're looking for. So they manage all that. As well as these situations when, you know, there was a board member who just wasn't showing up to board meetings very often, and wasn't communicating as well. And so our nominations and governance committee chair did have a meeting with them. And basically that's just the phone call, right? To say, hey, we noticed you're not showing up. What's going on? Wanted to check in. Do you think that this is still a good fit for you? Do you think, you know, and in this case of the specific board member, they had been a volunteer of the organization for a very long time. And I think once they came onto board service, they had a different experience with the org that they weren't as excited about. And so it ended up not being a good fit. And we did end their term early. And it was just, you know, it wasn't a good fit, doesn't always work out, and people aren't always, you know, or people might overcommit and not be as available as they think they're going to be, or things might change in life. And so I think that open communication, having somebody, either ideally it's a fellow board member who is there to help, ideally your board chair if you don't have a specific committee for this, but that way the board members are holding each other accountable, and someone's checking in to say, hey, you're not fulfilling these duties. What's going on?
Jackie, how have you gone about setting expectations for board members?
Good question. We don't have, well, being a small board, the committee system is hard to implement because you end up with a committee of one, or, you know, or committee of two, and if one doesn't show up, then you're still at one. So we manage the organization as pretty much a group. I mean, when we have our quarterly board meetings, of course, we have to have a quorum. Everyone is familiar with the activities that are going on with the organization. You know, very aware of just the day-to-day operations of it. As I said, because it is small, we do a lot of work for such a small board, but that's just the nature of the community that we serve and the work that we do. So it's I guess the best way to explain it is kind of a committee of the whole. You know, it works because in terms of, it is very much a challenge to recruit board members, particularly when you are very active with dealing with community problems. It's very difficult to communicate, to recruit individuals who mirror the population of the community. Just like I said, our community is 76% African American, and it's difficult. It's a difficult assignment to because they do recognize how much work it takes in order to actually make a difference in the community. And so as I said, I ensure that, and I'm always, when I'm out, just say on a paddle, we organize a paddle and we get people to go down the river, and we do that all summer. And I see people that I think might be interested, and they say, why don't we get together and consider joining the board? And it's not easy to get a yes out of that question as you might think, because a lot of people join boards to be a member, but not necessarily to be action oriented on almost a day-to-day basis. That's probably a little more than most are interested in signing up for. And with South River Watershed Alliance, that's pretty much what it takes. When I have to on Saturday morning get our kayaks and canoes down to the river for all-day river paddle, it's the board members who do that. It's and on and on and on. So I think in terms of my input into this the group today is that and listening to the other members of this panel, and you almost have to have the capacity to do the kinds of board activities that we're talking about today. And if you don't have that capacity, then there's absolutely no way to carry it out. But the organization still needs to function, and that's kind of where I am. So like I said, just in terms of committees, we just don't have that luxury. And yeah, it's something I struggle with, and I do a lot more than some days that I should, but that's just the nature of it.
Jackie, I appreciate you saying that, because I know that you are not the only one in that situation. In fact, most of the people in this room are in exactly that situation. And it is incredibly challenging. It's one thing to sit here and talk about best board practices. It's a completely different thing to be dealing with that in real life. And I guess I would just say, like, from my own perspective, always take these kinds of things and be gentle with yourself. And these are not meant to be trainings that make you feel like, oh, I'm doing everything wrong. I'm not doing what all these other people are doing. Of course you're not. Evelyn's organization is a lot bigger and a lot better resourced. The idea is to inspire some thoughts about, maybe what's one little thing that we could try that might help. What's an idea that we could maybe run with? What's worked for other people? Never take it like I have to do all of this, because that would be crazy. You cannot do all of it. Okay, just I'll get off my soapbox, but I really want us to address one final question before we open up to Q&A, because I'm seeing lots of great questions already in the chat. I'm taking notes on all of them. We'll get to that. But I'm seeing a common thread, and I think it relates to our planned question, which is like, what happens when it doesn't go right? What happens when there's some kind of conflict? And I thought it would be helpful if each of you might share, kind of like a personal example of how, you navigated some kind of conflict with a board. I am sure you all have some stories. So who would like to kick us off on that one?
I mean, I spoke a little bit to it, so I can start us off, I guess. So I was hired on to bring the org in a new direction. And in Seattle, the topic of racial equity and environmental justice, some folks don't take too well to that. Some folks don't like those conversations. And so when I joined the team, I told them that, with this shift, and if you pass this strategic plan, please know that we are going to lose some supporters, right? There are going to people that are, and in fact, people that did like make comments to us, like, keep planting trees, focus on planting trees, don't do anything else. And so we knew we would lose supporters, but also that we would also gain new supporters, right? That it would also shift our audience significantly. And so one of our board members was really having a hard time with this shift, particularly as he thought about who he would invite to our annual gala and the table that he would fill, and the tough conversations that he had to have with the people at his table the year before that already didn't like it. And so luckily I had generally the board was supportive of this new direction and wanted this new direction, right? That's why they brought me on. And so they were able to have my back in those tough moments during those tough conversations, and tell that board member, like, well, this is where it's your responsibility to do education, right? It's your responsibility to talk to the folks in your community, to change their minds, to educate them, to help them become more responsive to the changing needs. This board member ultimately was just not in alignment. And so we did have to have a couple meetings and some tough conversations about whether or not this was a continued good fit for them. Ultimately, they decided it was not. And that was okay, and so being okay with letting folks go, I think, is a big thing. And then I also mentioned that other board member who just wasn't showing up. I think they just preferred being a volunteer. And so there could be a number of reasons why it's not always a good fit. I think additionally, in our case, we've had some situations where board members have felt like, my development director only goes to them for money. And they didn't like that. And so I think it's also navigating, and the way that I try to see it is like, they are a set of donors and you should treat them as such, right? There is stewardship and work that needs to be done with the board. It should not be just a transactional relationship. And so I think making sure that you're stewarding your board members all the time, that you're keeping them engaged, that you're going to them for problem solving anytime you need support in a variety of areas. So keeping in mind their expertise. So we have an attorney. So anytime there's a legal question or I want a document reviewed, I reach out to that attorney, right? And so making sure they're involved in a variety of ways also helps prevent problems. And I'll pass it to Pam.
Just want to echo everything that Evelyn just said. One thing that I think is really important when you get into situations or before actually you get into situations of conflict is having the board have a policy to exit somebody who's not a good fit. Because sometimes people will, of their own volition, if they're falling down on the job, they're not making meetings, will either admit that, or when confronted by another board member, sort of say, yeah, it's probably not a good fit, I don't have the capacity, and then we'll leave. But sometimes these people don't want to leave. And if you don't have a process for accountability such that they can be rotated off when they're not meeting their obligations, that can become a problem, particularly for, smaller organizations that, really depend on everybody pulling their weight. And if you have someone on the board who's, not doing that, or as I saw a question in the chat, actively undermining the work of the board or the organization, that can be very toxic. So it's really important to have a process and a structure in place for exiting people who are not meeting the expectations of the board in a transparent and fair way, meaning, the process should include communication with that person and, outlining how they're not meeting those expectations and a timeline for response. And then when those things aren't met, then the person can go and then there's a process for that. When you don't have a process, that can just lead to very drawn out and really complicated. I've seen so many of our grantee organizations have to struggle with situations like that. And I noted another question in the chat about someone who was, I think, a founding member of the board, not liking the direction, a new direction the organization was going. It's a really kind of common thing when the organization can make a shift, and like as Evelyn was saying, not everybody's kind of on board with it. And so it's really important that you have open and consistent communication among the board members and with the staff about mission and values of the organization, and creating a respectful culture where people have to, join together and sign on to those values, or realize that this is not a good fit for them and move on. And I just can't stress enough how important it is to have those kind of policies, because I've seen those conflicts play out.
Tom or Jackie, you want to speak to this conflicts you've navigated?
Sure. So let me just pick up something that Pam said, which seems a little self-serving for a capacity building organization, but I'm just going to say it because it is true. While it's not a cure for founder syndrome, whether if it's on your on the staff side or on the board side, is to have a strategic planning process that invites multiple sources to contribute to defining what is important for the organization and how and which direction that it ought to go. So I'll just point that out. If you want to know how to manage that, I'm not saying that you could completely eliminate it, but how to manage it is through a strategic planning process. So that you may want to think about that. I think, I'm just going to focus just real quick on mentioning how helpful advisory committees or advisory council could be for your organization. This is this whole notion of what Stephen Covey said, having the right person in the right seat in the right bus. That could make a big difference. So from a recruitment standpoint, you don't always have to bring people in onto the board for that person to make a meaningful contribution. I think you may want to try some people out before you actually, kind of bringing them further in. Governance is a very different type of proposition. Not everybody should come on your board, and you should be very selective about it. So this is where, some people are saying, well, should family members serve on the board or married folks? Well, why can't, in that case, maybe have one of the person serve on an advisory committee or advisory council, and then the other person on the governing board. They could both contribute to the organization in a meaningful way. The advisory council also is a really great way to think about, are there something that we need in terms of expertise? They don't have to participate in governance, but they can make a meaningful contribution. So I think it's actually helped in a lot of the organizations that I've worked with and also that I've been on the board with. So, I was, and if you do need to really gently ask someone to leave the governing board, there's somewhere that they can actually land on, right? So that you're not completely losing them, but that they're just not the right fit for the governing role.
Jackie, thoughts?
Just one comment. In all of the, I've had people leave the board, and replace them. But about a month ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, was the first time that I actually had a conflict with a board member. And like I said, we are a small board. When you get together, it's not committees. It's everybody in the same room all the time. And that's good. That's how we operate. I want people to know how difficult it is to operate this organization. But I think the issue with that particular board member was that he was actually on another board that was much larger and had a totally different mission. It was a big national board that he was on. And I'll just say it's Boy Scouts of America, and that's been around forever. And it's totally different. And trying to make that transition from still serving on that board and a much smaller grassroots activist-oriented organization like South River Watershed Alliance was just too much of a leap. And we he challenged me one day at a meeting, and I ended the meeting and said, we need to meet. And we did, over breakfast. And it was a conversation like, this is not Boy Scouts of America. This is totally different. And if it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. I hope you stay, but don't ever challenge me again in front of my board, because I won't forgive you for that. I'll give you a pass this time, but don't ever do that again. And he finally left, and that was fine, and because it was taking a lot of energy. It was sucking up the energy in the room, as a matter of fact. That's the most significant problem I've had. The board members that I've got, they really love, I think, being on the board because they do feel useful. It's not that they, it's every day they feel useful because I can call them up. It's not like waiting for a meeting, call them up and say, can you help me do this? Or can you help me do that? And, usually they will. So I've learned just from managing the board, as our executive director is part-time. Let me say that, does a wonderful job at marketing, but does not really perform in the role of an executive director. She's a part-time staff person. So that falls pretty much just managing the board and keeping them informed and active. I won't say busy because they're busy all the time, but active. It's what I do. And again, to folks on the call, I just think when it comes to frontline grassroots organizations, we have to differentiate. And maybe that's kind of a goal going forward is to when we're looking at these different organizations, get a good feel for what it is they do and how the structure of the organization supports that. Because everybody can't afford a big board. Everybody can't afford an executive director. Everybody can't afford committees. Great if you can, but you still are doing really important work, and it needs to be done. And we just have to figure out what our niche looks like, what it looks like in that bigger context of the general view of a functioning board.
Thanks, everyone. I want to open it up to everyone else who's in the room and start getting some of these questions answered. So yeah, Pearl, if you want to stop pinning us, that would be lovely. We can see everyone. Yeah, hi all. If you'd like to ask a question directly of the board, I would absolutely love that. Feel free to take yourself off mute and say something. If someone else is already talking, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. I've also been collecting questions out of the chat, so I'll throw some of those in the mix. But does anyone have a question that they want to ask about their own board?
Yeah, I manage a coalition. It's not so we don't have a formal board. We have a steering committee. And we have some of the problems that you all have talked about, people who've been on since the very beginning. And we have 37 organizations that are part of the coalition, and we need to do a leadership change, that you all have been talking about. But has anybody ever had, or can you give me some insight about where I could go for resources, how to get the coalition groups to engage in this? They love the steering committee is taking care of all the administration of the organization, and they're fine. The activities the organization does is exactly what they want. That's why they're members of the coalition. But we really need some new blood. So how do I engage the coalition members in helping be a part of that process?
Anyone want to speak to that?
So maybe I could kind of start us off. I've been a longtime activist in communities and been involved in a number of different things. And I think, you know, ideally that you would have come to some agreements, right? Because some operating agreements. And while you may not have like bylaws necessarily, but that you need something to help govern and to help organize and lead the coalition. So I think that if you know, I wonder what do you have now and what can you add to that so that there's some clarity as to how folks should operate. Otherwise, I think it could get a bit chaotic, especially if there are factions within your coalition that feel very strongly that, you know, the coalition's not going in the right direction, or there's not certain things that are prioritized and that sort of thing. And even with some clarity of in terms of, you know, how you function and how you operate, there still may be some, fractions of people that can actually have differences, but at least you have general agreement to that. So that's what I would suggest, if you could actually have a conversation around that, and then to determine what those agreements are.
We were starting on that process pre-COVID.
Okay,
It got derailed, but that's a good suggestion. Thanks for the reminder.
sure.
Kate, do you want to ask a question, please?
Sure. Hi, thank you. Yeah, my name's Kate Schroeder. I'm in the development staff for one of the Rose Foundation's grantees, but then I'm also a board chair of another smaller grassroots nonprofit. And I have a question that actually applies to both. Would love to hear from any of the panelists, just any advice you have, best practices, lessons learned on leadership succession for the board. I think you can have great leaders in place, but it's sort of this constant practice of trying to get that next tier of people who are moving towards being, you know, your president or, you know, whatever other important offices you have. And I don't feel like we've cracked that nut in either of the two boards that I'm in. So I'd love to hear your advice.
I can maybe speak to that a little bit. I would say one thing that I've seen can be helpful in those situations is, well, obviously the people who are serving as officers are typically kind of the pipeline for new leadership. So the VP becomes the president, et cetera. Having conversations amongst the officers as they're, you know, looking at their term ending about who to tap, and then having you know, one-on-one conversations with the potential candidates that you want to feed into the pipeline, and then, you know, frank conversations about what's involved in their kind of day-to-day work, or and also with the staff too, about what the expectations are in terms of communication with the board members, and support that might be needed in the transition, I think can be helpful. Again, I know I'm kind of beating a dead horse here, but having job descriptions even within the officer corps of sort of like, here's what the president does, here's what the treasurer does, here's what the, you know, secretary does, it can be helpful in orienting people who aren't in that leadership loop of what is expected. Because sometimes in organizations, that group of people, the executive committee, ends up doing a lot of work that maybe the rest of the board is not aware of, because they're not involved in the day-to-day. And recognizing, it's a great way to show recognition and support for the people who are doing the extra work, and making sure that they get, you know, they get the kudos from their colleagues about the work that they're doing, but also then making sure that you can help build that pipeline. So awareness, and I think communication is a big part of that.
Been a lot of questions in the chat about how to break up with a board member who's been around for a very long time. I'm wondering if any of you could speak more specifically to that question. Like, you know, that there's reasons this person's still involved. They're contributing in certain ways. How do you actually have that difficult conversation with someone? How do you prepare for that?
I can try hit that one. I've never been in that situation. But I would tell you what I would do if I was in that scenario. I think honesty is really, really important, and transparency, and showing gratitude, right? So making sure that you ensure that this person is honored and as much as possible for their service, especially if they've been a long time or a founding board member. And I would say also bringing in their peers. So again, utilizing other board members to help support you in this conversation so that it's not just you. And so everyone's in alignment. And again, you want your role to be minimal and you want the other board members to be speaking. So any board members who you see as allies, I think is really important. Ideally, someone like your board chair or one of the officers should be in this conversation of just being like, you know, we feel like you've really done a great service. We're so we're so grateful for you all these years, and like, you know, and list any accomplishments or any great things that the org has done because of their support. And maybe mention that, you know, you feel that it's time that, you know, you want to change things up with the board, and that you feel like it's really important for the organization's progress to bring on new board members with fresh eyes, and that maybe it's time that they think about stepping down their service. And if they're not prone to that, then you might have to be more forceful. If they don't like kind of take that and just step down, you might have to be like, you know, hopefully it doesn't take a situation where you have to get the whole board to do an official vote to get them to step down. But I think just like recognizing the importance of like changing things up, of getting new perspective, of allowing different people on the board, and that you still want them to be part of the organization. And if there's a different capacity, you know, we have lots of volunteer opportunities. So if your org has different capacities that they can still contribute in, I think that's really important to bring them and steward them in that way of like, you know, we think your role, it might be a good time to shift your role that you've played at this organization, and steer them in a new direction.
Thanks, Evelyn. I appreciate the comment about gratitude. I feel that. Anyone else, board or panelist or non-panelist, have experience doing this? Tommy,
I would definitely stick with the facts as much as possible. You know, I'm not saying you can't inject any emotion to it, but I would say just, you know, if it is really about board, like attendance at meetings, I think it would be helpful to note that and explain why, you know, like not being able to reach a quorum could really jeopardize how we make decisions and move forward and those kinds of things. And, you know, so in that sense, it's like, it's not you, it's our needs type of thing. And then the other thing too is, if you're going to have the conversation, this is more of a how-to, make sure that you don't just show up trying to formulate what you're going to talk about. Just really get some talking points in place. I mean, not like a script, but at least if you need to sort of refer back to some facts or whatnot, you have that right on, you know, right on hand. And, you know, when you're already feeling uncomfortable, you don't want to kind of fumble through what you're going to talk about. So I mean, I think you do need to do some level of preparation. That tends to help.
Jackie, did you want to follow up with something before I ask Megan?
You know, yeah, I was just, you know, I would assume most of the boards we're talking about now volunteer. So, you know, it's really kind of hard to fire someone from a volunteer job. So I would really, you know, first look at the reason, because for me, that would really dictate the conversation. If they aren't coming to meetings, that's an easy conversation. You know, you seem to be busy and, you know, can you suggest someone maybe take your place? I think that's an easy one. So I think in terms of dismissing people from a volunteer position, kind of depends on the reason that they are not volunteering. And use that as the segue into, you know, do you want to stay on? Is there something else you really rather do than be on the board, maybe volunteer? So that kind of helps you help them make a decision rather than going at it from the standpoint of dismissing someone from a position that for which they volunteered, you know, to help.
Megan, do you
I think one other thing that might be helpful too is not having the conversation be one-on-one. Because if things become heated, it becomes a he said, she said kind of situation. It's helpful to have another board member present, one who hopefully has a relationship with the other board member, so that it comes from a little more of a neutral place, and that you have then a third party who can corroborate what is said in the meeting and, you know, what's agreed to, whatever. It's just useful.
Thanks, Pam. Megan, what was your question?
Thank you. I just wanted to mention something that happened on our board. We had a similar situation where we had a very beloved and very wonderful board member who just stopped communicating with us for a really long time. And for us, the way to navigate that whole thing was extreme patience and moving extremely slowly with him, because we cared deeply about him and we knew that there had to be something going on with him. So we just waited. We sent him emails. We made phone calls. We asked people who knew him how he was doing. And it came out in the end that he had been very ill and he really wasn't able to do the work of the board. And he really wasn't able to even communicate that with us because he felt so much emotion around it and he was very upset by the whole thing. So for us, the key was just moving slowly and keeping communication open and communicating in any way that we could. And then in the end, we gave him a year's grace. We said, why don't you just take a year off, see how you're doing in a year and come back to us if you can. So that's what we did. And that worked out just perfectly. And in the end, he did not come back to us, but we remained very close and we still are. So that's how we dealt with that.
Thanks for that example, Megan. What about, okay, wait, before I go into that. So we're getting towards the end of the session. So I'm gonna have Perla share in the chat the evaluation survey. We would really appreciate it if you would fill out the couple of questions and let us know what you thought of the session, what we could do better in the future. It really helps us in planning for next year. But while you all are working on that, we'll continue the conversation. And so I wanted to ask the panelists a question about like working with diverse boards, like any advice for like managing boards where you've got members from very different backgrounds.
I just will chime in because this is something that the foundation board sort of experienced when it went through its transition to reach out to the community. I would say it's really important when you're recruiting new board members from communities that have not been represented before in your board is to not do it in a solo enterprise. Nobody wants to be that token person, and that is a huge burden to put on one person. So inviting multiple people to join who are coming from those different backgrounds creates a peer cohort and a sense of belonging that I think is really important. And also doing a lot of work before you even bring people into the board about, you know, creating space for new people's ideas and perspectives, and understanding that when you're bringing new people into the mix, they are going to have, you know, different opinions, and that that's okay, that they need to be able to feel like they can contribute and offer their own perspectives that might be different from the people who previously served. Just like Evelyn was saying, that I think it's important that if that is the direction the organization is going, that it's supported by the board members and that that's communicated to new people coming in.
Tom has shared some resources in the chat. We'll write that down and share that with everyone.
I mean, just to add to everything that Pam said, which I completely am in agreement with, and I love, is just remember they have different backgrounds. They come from different spaces, so those financial requirements are going to be different. Or I hope that your board does an effort to not ask them for their money, but to ask them for other areas where they can support using their expertise and their lived experience.
Any other questions that folks would like to ask the panel? Hearing no one jumping to it, I have one. So what do you do if your board is pretty much your staff and they're not doing anything, right? Like they're the capacity behind this, they're your core volunteers, and they're not pulling their weight? Any ideas from the panelists or anyone else in the room? Has anyone else dealt with this issue?
I think, you know, at that point, and it's, you pretty much described South River Watershed Alliance. I mean, and as I said, you know, we're 9 people and we're 10, one person left. And I think as a working board, when you have folks, the minimum number or a small number and a person or several people are not carrying their weight, then that's that, you know, for me, and I'm at that point, and after our fundraiser next week, I'm likely going to have that conversation. At that point, you know, I have to find or do some active recruiting because then you are impacting the ability of the board to function. It's quite clear of what is a governing board and a working board. It's very clear to tell that, you know, with South River Watershed Alliance. So it's absolutely critical that the folks on the board are at least willing to carry some weight of ensuring that the organization meets its goals and objectives. And so for me, that's a much easier conversation to have with a board member, you know, as opposed to some of these more esoteric kinds of governance issues, you know, that might arise. So I think it you know, in terms of, you know, having the ability to move people off and move people on kind of depends on the structure of the board that you have. If you have the luxury, and honestly, I do call governing boards that just govern and come to me as a luxury. But if you don't have that luxury and you actually depend on them for the functioning, the efficient and effective functioning of the organization, you know, it's important that you have people that are willing to step up and help perform, you know, in that role. It's actually absolutely critical. And so, as I said, making the decision to have that conversation to say, hey, this is who we are, this is what we do. I can't do it without you. And if, you know, if you don't have the time, I appreciate that, but I need to find someone else. And I think they will appreciate that. I mean, it's yeah, just honesty, just between, you know, 2 people, honest conversation.
Thanks, Jackie. Any
Yeah, I
other
was going to
comments?
also just kind of jump in. Definitely, I agree with what Jackie's saying. I think it's also important to have cross training. I mean, if you could think of it as a basic HR sort of opportunity or a challenge, you always want to make sure that you have other people who can step up. So if you could be proactive as possible in making sure that other people could step up when they need to, I think would be the best case scenario.
Wonderful. All right, all. Well, that leaves us at time. Thank you for the wonderful discussion. And thank you so much to our fabulous panelists, to all the Rose staff who helped make this possible, to our interpreters, Marcy and Paulina. Much, much gratitude to everyone. All right. Wonderful to see you all. And if you are in the Bay Area, I hope we've got a chance to see you in person next Friday. All right.
I wish.
Yeah, I know, Jackie, someday we'll get you out here.
All right. Have a good
Thank
weekend.
you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.
Thank
Bye,
you.
all.